Guild Wars, Sea of Sorrows. Chapter 11. Not many spellcasters have the intellectual fortitude for a spell of that magnitude. The cosmogony of the sigil matrix has to be incredibly precise. Are you quite sure it works? Extremely. I've done it on numerous occasions. You can rely on symmetry to stabilize it so long as the structure is etherically ideal. Ideal? The Asura blinked. How do you make that kind of a matrix conform to an ideal? By definition, its points of light are randomized. Not randomized, Vera corrected Matcha gently. Not arbitrary or accidental either. Only inconsistent, subjective. Once you take into account the factors that misalign the sigil's plane, you can predict the pattern. Masha clamped her palms to her head. But your theory precludes thousands of potential algorithms. It's daunting at first, yes, but you get a feel for it. Viraj shrugged, pushing his reddish hair behind his ears. It didn't stay there long, fluttering down around his face again the moment his hand fell to the drawing. If only I had my staff. It's really quite relaxing to do once you know how. A pity magic can't be done without weapon focuses. This really is much easier to understand if you simply see it done. I'm sure if you ask, Pirandra will gladly give you back your staff so you can teach. Maybe she'll give me back my pistols too. I'm in the mood to hand some education of my own to those guards, Kobaya grumped. Exchanging a wearied look with his friend, Sycox leaned against the cold stone wall and rubbed a paw through the salt-clumped fur at the back of his neck. Well, at least someone's having a good time. In another cell, the dark-haired sailor, Henst, sharpened a loose stone against the wall and grunted in bored agreement. Their prison was underground, beneath the watch commander's station house. The walls were made of hewn earth, reinforced with thick oak beams. Iron bars separated 4 large cells, with a small central hallway where prisoners were led down from above. There were 2 wooden cots in each cell, as well as a chamber pot with a lid. Thin windows, only 6 inches tall, allowed a fillet of morning light to illuminate each cell. The floors were hard-packed earth with a light covering of straw. Comfortable and humane, really, for a prison, thought Kobaya. They'd been here only a couple days while the guard readied the gallows. He'd stayed far longer and far worse. The prisoners from the Capricorn debacle had been separated into 3 cells. Matcha, Kobaya, Isai, and 2 of her crew were in one of them. Virad, Henst, and the other sailors were in the second, and Sycox was alone in the third. None of the thin cots could hold the char, so he sat on the ground amid the hay and mourned his fate. 2 days. They'd been rotting in this cell for 2 days, with no sign of escape or release. Kobaya stood on the cot in his cell, leaning morosely against the shelf of his narrow barred window. Yesterday had been sunny, and he'd been able to glimpse the Capricorn under full sail. All hands on board were waving and yelling during the casting-off celebration on the docks. Today, on the other hand, was dawning gray and cold. "It's not so bad, Sycox," Kobaya said, trying to cheer him up. "At least they're feeding us. Human food." The Shar slumped, and his tail smacked rhythmically against the floor. "What I wouldn't give to eat something that kicks when I bite it." You could apply the same aspect ratio ideology to astronomical calculations, too, Matcha was saying excitedly. She and the elementalist Verad sat at the shared bars between their cells, heads bowed together as they drew in the dirt with bits of hay. "I suppose you could," Virad agreed. "Take the sigil plane and apply it to Tyria's horizon. Then find 2 points to triangulate instead of simply measuring the singular aspect of the sun's verticality." Matcha stared, utterly absorbed by the patterns he'd drawn in the earth. Upstairs, the thick oak door to the dungeon cells creaked on its hinges. Heavy boots lumbered down the stairs. 4 burly guardsmen carrying lengths of rope tromped down to stand in the central hallway. Behind them came Watch Commander Pirandra, thin lips twisted into a satisfied smile. Tie everyone securely before you take them from the cells. As for the char, she drew a large pair of iron manacles from her belt and tossed them onto the ground in front of Sikok's cage. He's too big to hang. Clap his arms and legs in irons and throw him into the sea. It was a relatively simple task to hold the human crew and Matcha at sword point and tie their hands simple, that is, when compared with the effort required to manacle a char. By the time the guards were finished, their tabards were torn, their armor dented, and their faces bloodied by swipes of Sikok's claws. One had a concussion, another's head was wedged tightly between the cell bars, a third cursed energetically and hobbled on a twisted ankle. Though he fought valiantly, Sikok's was finally cuffed and chained. The prisoners were attached to a long strand of rope and then paraded out of the prison and through the town of Port Stalwart. Kobaya counted 10 guards in all, including the 2 still nursing their wounds back at the watch commander's headquarters. 11, if you counted Pierandra. Taking a moment to size up the watch commander's graceful step and thickly muscled arms, Kobaya decided to round the number up to 12. 12. There were almost as many prisoners if Izay and her crew were willing to take the risk. Kobaya glanced toward the tall woman, admiring how her dark hair shone with a soft reddish undertone in the morning light. Blinking, he snapped his head down again. 12 guards. Their numbers were close enough. The guards were carrying weapons. They had armor, and their hands were free. The prisoners, on the other hand, what we have, Kobaya thought, is 2 exhausted magic users and a very annoyed char. Kobaya sighed under his breath. We're doomed. A rough gallows had been erected at the end of the dock closest to the guardhouse. A dozen tall beams stood like scarecrows at the edge of the jetty, each bearing a short crossbar from which hung a length of rope. A man stood at the gallows, tying the ropes into 13 coiled hoop knots that sailors called the Devil's Window. Several locals gathered on the docks, fishermen and laborers, fellow sailors and local farmhands, all eager to see the show. Henst spat on them from his place in line, returning their jeers with taunts of his own. The rest of the prisoners marched quietly and kept their thoughts to themselves. A knot caught in Kobaya's throat as they marched ever closer. He scanned the vessels in the harbor as they walked past each one, but the Pride was not among them. She must have been still waiting, hidden in their false cove near the harbor mouth. Good, Kobaya thought. My crew won't have to see this. More, they won't be fools and risk their lives trying to save us before we hang. One by one, the prisoners were detached and moved to the individual gallows. Kobaya took his turn among them without complaint. Isay was placed beside him, the noose sliding over her head and tucked beneath the thick mane of her hair. She caught him looking and scowled. If you hadn't gotten in our way. In your way? We were there first. Your plan was stupid. Ours was better. So we should have just left? Excuse me, but I had a knife at my throat. I wasn't thinking about ladies first, especially not for one engaged in committing piracy. Successful piracy. She stressed the word. I had a plan. We'd worked everything out, every detail. We had enough sailors to man the sails and an elementalist to create wind enough to blow us ahead of any pursuit. And you, what were you doing? Jumping and hoping there'd be a net to catch you? Stung, Kobaya protested. It's always worked in the past. You are so short-sighted. How did you ever get to be a captain? Isay grumbled. By being short-sighted, of course, Kobaya retorted. The guard checking the knots hushed them as he moved past. But Kobaya ignored it. This might be his last few moments on Tyria, and Kobaya'd be damned if he'd let this woman go out with the last word. I've sailed from here to Cantha. I know every cove from Rada, some to the splintered coast, every shipping route from Port Stalwart to Port Noble. All that, Isay said, shifting grumpily in her noose, and you didn't take into account that the tide won't help you if you don't have the wind on your side as well? If we hadn't been there, you three would never have been able to get the sails down in time. I may not know your secret coves, but I know how to tell the exact minute the tide will turn. After Lion's Arch fell, I studied the new currents in the Sea of Sorrows until I knew them by heart. This woman was absolutely infuriating. We only needed the tide for a few minutes. Our ship was waiting at the harbor mouth to tow us out to sea. We had a chance. Until the djinn came, Kobaya said mournfully. Yeah, Issei's hazel eyes softened. Until the djinn came. They shared a long moment, silently cursing luck, timing, and Istani Jinn. Watch Commander Pirandra blew a long, somber note on a hunting horn. The chilly sound echoed over the gray cove as the morning mist thickened. As the note faded away, Kobaya's sharp ears caught the sound of waves lapping against ships' hulls, splashing on rocks, and rolling up the shore. In half an hour, the sun would rise and burn away the fog. The town would rouse from slumber. Sailors would report to their ships, and dockhands would begin the day's labor. Just a morning, like every other. Just another day. Goosebumps rose on Kobaya's arms as he realized it would be a day he'd never see. Guards stepped up from behind them, tightening the nooses. The prisoners are ready, Commander, one yelled. Watch Commander Pirandra marched solemnly along the row, gazing at each prisoner in turn. Virad muttered something under his breath as she passed, and the watch commander snarled. If you have a problem with your situation, pirate, she said, goading him, all you have to do is jump. Maybe you can swim away. Frowning, Virad twisted his hands in the ropes and did not reply. Reaching the end, the watch commander turned to face her prisoners. With a nod to the hangman, she prepared to blow a third and final note. When it sounded, the guards would push the prisoners from the edge of the dock, and it would all be over. Kobaya! Sikok shouted in desperation. Twisting his head to the side, he could see the valiant Char being forced toward the water by 3 stalwart-looking guardsmen with spears. I don't want to drown. I'd rather die fighting. The Char roared again, slashing at his enemies with manacled hands and hobbled feet. But he was little match for the long reach of their spears. Tears welled in Kobaya's eyes as he fought helplessly against his bonds. You really care about that Char, don't you? Issei murmured softly. Of course I care about him. Kobaya bit back something sharper. He's in my crew. Would you feel any different if they were going to drown hence? Issei bit her lip and shook her head in silent understanding. At the shore end of the dock, Watch Commander Pirandra raised the hunting horn, and Kobaya felt the sword against his side press in more deeply. Sikok's snarls and the clank of his chains filled the morning air, but Kobaya couldn't watch. He felt frozen without breath, every muscle tensed as if for battle. But the sound that pierced the slowly dissolving mist wasn't a hunting horn. Nor was it the massive splash that Kobaya expected to hear at any moment from the end of the pier where Sikok's was being pushed farther and farther toward the sea. Instead, Kobaya heard the sound of a mighty naval bell echoing across the water as a galleon burst out of the fog. Kobaya's heart leapt into his throat. He imagined the Pride coming to their rescue, or one of Masha's illusions, fooling their captors into giving them an opening for escape. But what he saw coming through the fog was none of those things. Instead, the mist was shredded by a rotted black prow. The ship was massive. Her gunwale rose 18 feet above the water, and her keel was sleek and sharp. 3 huge masts, broken and splintered along their length, nevertheless rose like bristling wires from the center of a barnacle-covered deck. Magic held them aloft as wind caught in her festering sails. The galleon wallowed in the water, but her heading was true, and as she tilted to bring her broadside about, Kobaya could see the sickly green gold of a brass figurehead guiding her over the murky waves. 6 arms rose from a woman's torso, 2 reaching up to the sky. 2 spread back against the ship in mute protection, and the lowest pair curling down at her sides. The smile on the figurehead's face may once have been lovely, but beneath the green tarnish and the blackened cracks in the brass, it had become the visage of a demon. The ship in the fog was the indomitable. "Dead ship," one of the guards on the dock screamed. He fell back, dropping his sword with a clatter onto the planking. "Dead ship, ahoy!" The first bloody red rays of morning crept through the mist, and Kobaya could see a second keel. Then a third, then more bursting out of the fog. Frigates and balanders, scows and carracks, with the mighty galleon at the fore. It was a nightmare armada. The ships were ruined, their hulls cracked and weathered, yet still they sailed on. The sailors on their riggings were blue with water, flesh sloughing away from still-moving bone. Hideous creatures swept past on spectral wings, tattered skin flapping in a twisted imitation of seabirds, but far more massive in scale. The undead armada bombarded the docked ships of Port Stalwart with ferocious enthusiasm. The galleon's broadside pealed out like thunder. Heavy black cannonballs launched through thick tufts of smoke, obscuring her open portholes. Kobaya had little time to react, and even if he'd had the presence of mind to yell, the sound of whistling flight would have drowned out any orders he'd have given. The shot roared into thunder as it struck, shredding holes in the moored ships, the wharves, and the long dock on which they stood. Some went farther, crashing into buildings by the shore and tearing into the city. Where the heavy iron struck wood, it exploded, casting chunks of timber and broken brick in every direction. The dock tilted to the side as several of the pylons holding it above water shattered out from under its boards. Kobaya heard the guards at the end of the wharf scream as creatures with tattered wings and fetid claws swooped down and snatched them away. Several of the guards broke and ran, dropping their weapons in a panic to reach the shore before the dock capsized into the sea. "Aye," Kobaya called. "The sword by your foot. Kick it to me." She looked down and discovered the weapon. Without hesitation, Isoi tucked the toe of her boot beneath it, flipping the sword into his hands. Kobaya turned and let the weapon slap against his back, trapping it with his tied arms as it slid down his body. "Back up against me. Cut your hands loose on the blade," he said in a rush. "Hurry. It'll take them 19 seconds to reload." She spun, bending as far forward as her noose would allow so that she could reach back with her tied hands. There was a sharp exclamation as Isai blindly found the sword's edge. Drawing the ropes across the blade, she was free. Isai wrenched the noose from her neck. "How do you know how long it takes that galleon to reload?" "Every ship's timing is different," she gasped, reaching to help Kobaya get free. "I know that ship," Kobaya said grimly. Isai cut him free, and as she did, a second peal of gunfire sounded from the galleon. This time, there were echoing booms from several of the smaller ships in the harbor. The sailors of Port Stalwart were beginning to fight back. Still, looking at the size and number of their enemy, they wouldn't be fighting for long. The dock trembled warningly beneath his feet. Through the screams of people fleeing the collapsing wharf and the war cries of sailors on ships being attacked, Kobaya heard a char's enraged bellow of pain. "Get Matcha," Kobaya said determinedly. "Take her to the shore with your crew." "The Asura?" Isai asked, baffled. "But," Kobaya cut her off, pushing the sword into Isai's hands. "Take this. Tell Matcha that I'm giving her an order to go with you. Take your men and get out of here," Isai. "Sycox and I will meet you afterward." "Meet? Do you even have a plan?" Isai snorted. "Of course not. You're Kobaya Mariner. Short-sighted as hell and too damn brave for your own good." She started to say something else, but instead impulsively leaned in and kissed his cheek. Don't worry about us. Just rescue your 6 cursed char and get out of here." With that, Isaiah turned and ran toward the other gallows, cutting captives free one by one as the guards fled toward the shore. The sound of clanking chains and another terrible howl broke through the chaos, dragging Kobaya's attention away from the dark-haired woman. "Sickox," he gasped. With alacrity, Kobaya spun toward the end of the pier and raced toward his engineer. The guards were scattering, fleeing from the collapsing dock as rotted sailors dropped from the fleet into the sea, making their way toward the town. Some swam above the water, others walked below the waves, leaving a thickening trail of mold and decaying flesh. They carried all manner of weapons, from knives and cutlasses to long shards of broken bone and clubs of shattered coral. Kobaya saw the last guard pulled down into the waves by undead swimming beneath the collapsing boards of the dock. There were battles up and down the shore, undead shuffling on the sand toward those living beings who stayed to fight. If Isaiah didn't move it and get to the shoreline soon, they'd be trapped on the docks. He didn't have time to worry about the others. Sickox, still chained, stood with his back to one of the pylons, staring in horror as revenants with pasteboard skin clambered up the shattered planks. Kobaya reached him just as the Indomitable released her third volley. 2 of the ships in the harbor, their crews trying desperately to get them under sail, were destroyed by the battering of the dead ship's broadside. Tugging at the manacles that bound his friend, Kobaya struggled to find some way to get them to open. They were solid steel, heavy, and sealed with a lock, and the chains that bound them to the set on Sickox's feet were equally stalwart. "Don't panic," Kobaya said, cursing. "I can get a knife. Jimmy this lock even as he said it." An explosion rocked one of the ships in the dock nearby. Their powder room must have caught fire, and the concussion shuddered the dock's already weak foundation. In a voice far too soft for their surroundings, Sickox whispered. One of the guards dropped it when the flying creatures took him. "Use it to kill me." "No, Sickox. I can get through these locks. Not before the undead get up here." "Then what?" "We outrun those things up there and swim the Sea of Sorrows to get away." The Shar shook his head dejectedly, his rusty mane shagging over broad shoulders. "You might make it, but me? But you can give me a better death than to be torn apart with my hands bound. You didn't give up on me when you fished me half dead out of the ocean. Don't give up on me now." Stung, Kobaya tugged at the manacles, trying to find any weakness in the steel. Bony hands scrabbled at the dock as the zombies pulled themselves up, gathering their footing as they hissed through barnacle-encrusted cheeks. Kobaya's stomach turned at the sight of them, and he focused on Sickox's bonds, hoping desperately that he wouldn't see anyone he knew, or had known. "What in the 4 legions are you good for then, human?" Sickox roared back. "Help me die like a char. Don't let me go out like some kind of flopping, wet fish. Toughen up. You're nothing but a spineless pudding." "A pudding? Really? That's the best insult you've got?" "I'm under pressure here," Sickox snapped. Out of nowhere came the crack of a pistol and the sharp whiz of shot flying past. Kobaya spun, grabbing for the spear, while Sickox roared and instinctively raised his claws. Both stared, awestruck, as the manacles fell away from his wrists. There was a second shot, the ringing of metal on metal, and the shackles on his feet sprang open. "Magic?" Sickox said, mystified. "Accuracy, you idiot." Standing back at the gallows with Isai, Matcha raised a stolen flintlock pistol to her lips and blew a puff of smoke from the barrels. "Have you ever known me to obey an order?" she asked with a self-satisfied purr of scorn. "Anyway, the shore's covered with zombies. We can't go that way." Aggrieved and annoyed, Matcha stuck out her tongue at them both. Kobaya threw up his hands in exasperation, but there was no time to argue. The undead were upon them,